Welcome to the Fenton History Center lecture. Tonight we have Ned Ward talking to us, but I have to get a few pitches in for the Fenton History Center. We have our Saints and Sinners Cemetery Tour tickets on sale now, and I've been told we've already sold 36 carriage tickets, so if you want to ride on the carriages, it's time to call or get online. Then I wanted to let you know that next month, September 15th, Dennis Webster is coming to talk to us about the Lucille M. Wright Museum, which is down in the Hotel Jamestown building. And we have 2 more walking tours left this summer. This Saturday, it's Hidden Alleys with Cindy Dustin at 10 o'clock. And then the last Saturday of August, the 29th, Janet Wahlberg and Mike Rollin are going to talk about the Ladies of Lakeview. And that starts at 10 o'clock at the cemetery. And I think, was there anything else I want to mention? Sam. Ned is stepping in tonight because Karen Livesey and Sam Jenko are not able to do their talk. Sam passed away a few weeks ago. And so we're going to have a remembrance, or we're going to have a night to remember Sam and do a lot of laughing, I think. Next Monday, the 24th, from 4 to 7 here at the Fenton. It's kind of going to be a pizza party, so, we're going to have some fun. So please try to come. All right, now we'll get started. Chautauqua Lake Small Steamboats is Ned's 9th book, 7 of which have been published. He also has published numerous technical papers and conference proceedings for the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation during his career at Signor Incorporated in Ellicottville, New York. Ned is a member of the Bemis Point Historical Society, the Fenton History Center, the Chautauqua County Historical Society, and the Lawson Family Boating Heritage Museum. He's presenting on his most recent published book, Chautauqua Lake Small Steamboats, on Wednesday, August 26th. That's next Wednesday at 7 o'clock. That and all monthly presentations at the Lawson are free and open to the public. Tonight's presentation is based on his book, The Last Raft, which chronicles the history of harvesting the massive virgin forest that originally covered much of Chautauqua County's watershed, how that lumber was harvested, and the unique waterway which permitted that lumber to be shipped to market. It also highlights the importance of the products of the forest that covered Chautauqua County to the economic growth of our area and the tools and equipment which were invented and manufactured here to permit the harvesting. Welcome, Ned, and thank you for stepping in.
Thank you for asking.
I'm going to get that, although all of you.
Thank you, Joni. I'd like to welcome you this evening. And as Joni said, we're going to talk a little bit about the lumber industry in Chautauqua, how it came to be, and some of the remnants of it. So, start off, have to go back to the very beginning of the white settlement of our area, and I've got a map of the Holland land purchase, which is basically everything west of the Genesee in New York State. And I'm not real concerned about the early parts of it until we get up to the 1798, 1800 era, when Joseph Ellicott brought in about 130 surveys and began to section off the what's now Western New York for sale by the Holland Land Company. Most of those lots that he broke off went to small farmers. They were 20 to, at the most, 100 acres. There were some larger opportunities. Dr. Thomas Kennedy, 3,000 acres in that town. Edward Work down here in Faulkner, 1,260 acres. James Prendergast here in Jamestown, about 1,000 acres. So there were some larger purchases, but most were small lots. The people were poor. Many of them had failed in the eastern part of New York State and up in New England. Came here because they heard land was cheap and they were going to farm. Chautauqua is made up basically of glaciated land, and it's what we call a glacial till, extremely poor for farming. So many of these folks who had farmed and failed came here and didn't do much better. So they turned their sights to the most abundant products here in western New York, and that was the forest. We had a virgin forest unlike anybody could remember in Europe, certainly most of the rest of the world. So Ellicott came, he broke the place into saleable acreage, and the settlers really liked him because he was pretty innovative. He became the agent for the Holland Land Company, and he had a lot of practices favorable to the settlers. He discounted interest rates. He accepted things other than cash for payment, livestock, ashes, things like that. Permitted settlers to work off their indebtedness, doing road repair and road installation and other improvements. And he lent money for certain things that he felt would be a benefit to the whole community, one of which was sawmills. Because typically you get a sawmill and it becomes the nexus or the center or the hub for a community. And that was pretty well the case here. So as he was surveying, he took copious notes of what he found in the area, and in particular, trees which made the boundaries of those lots that he was breaking up. He called those witness trees, and he kept accurate records as to the species of those trees from which we derive these percentages over here on the right. I've highlighted white pine as being about 11% of the total forests in Chautauqua County at that time. So the reason I do is because white pine became the tree of choice. Why? Number one, it has a very low density, or weight per unit measure. As compared to sugar maple, it's about half as dense, so it floated. It also could be worked very readily with simple tools. It had on the Janka scale, which is Janka is a metal ball, 5/8 of an inch metal ball, which is pushed into the wood, and the distance it goes into the wood determines its Janka scale. So the white pine ends up being the most workable of most of the trees that were found in western New York. So it became the tree of choice. And they were big trees. They were huge trees. This particular tree, this picture, was 381-year-old white pine. It yielded 6 16-foot logs, a 14-foot log, and a 12-foot log. That equated to 6,000 board feet of lumber. Now, what does that mean? Well, a home today is about 2,000 square feet. And you can make a home of today which requires about 16,000 to 24,500 board feet of lumber with 4 of those trees. So it's amazing to think of trees that large. So how did we use all that? We used it for building homes, heating, manufacturing chemicals like potash and pearl ash, manufacture of millwork and sash, boxes, bee supplies, shingles, lath, and timbers. So it was really well used. If you look at the early homes, they were small. This was about the size of what would have been the Griffith family home south of Bemis, about 16 by 20, one-room home. It was made of logs. The logs were what we call saddled on the ends so that one log dropped into a U-shaped cut made in the one below it. And it had usually a single door and very seldom a window. If it did have a window, it was generally speaking several layers of paper that were dipped in lard, which made the paper translucent and gave it some rigidity. But most had no windows. Used the brush for the roof and wasn't much of a home. It was chinked between the logs with a mix of mud and plant matter so that keep the heavy drafts from coming in. And generally it had one interior fireplace which heated the entire home. So it didn't take much to, as far as cutting down trees, to make a few of those homes. When they got done making the home, they would girdle the trees. Typically that killed them, allowed them to plant gardens. Later on, they began to pull the stumps from the original trees, and there are many, many stump extractors like the one on the left that were invented here in Chautauqua County, different designs. They could pull up to 40 to 60 of those stumps a day. I pull one and I'm pretty well done. Norm, how about that?
Well, I don't know how they got into those big ungainly things. They were slow work.
Yes, they were. I don't remember it, but this stump fence was out on Tom's Point, and they used that to keep the cows or the beef or the chickens or whatever in and keep the wolves out. So, wasn't a lot of people here. About 2,400 people took articles on their land, and they didn't do so very well paying it off. So they turned to the woods and timbering the woods. What did they get from it? They burned mostly hardwoods. They would cut the logs, and the brush they'd cut first and put under them, and then put the logs on top, and then have what we call logging bees, where they would burn that ash, or burn that wood to ash, and then collect it, and they would leach it out to make what we call pioneer soap. They also took it to places like Asheville, which had 4 ashery ovens, and they would further refine it to make black salt and pearl ash, and that was shipped up to Canada in many cases. A gentleman by the name of Walter Smith from the North County made himself $75,000 in 1 year selling wood ash. Almost unbelievable. And they used it in baking powder, in place of baking powder. They also used it as a ingredient for glass making and in certain medicines. Ten acres of hardwood ash made 1 ton of potash, and Smith exported 500 tons from Westfield in 1 year. So that's 5,000 acres that we denuded of those trees to get the potash. Use of our timbers, remember the breakdown of the various trees that were in Chautauqua County. Hemlock was fairly prevalent, and they would take the bark from hemlock trees because it contained tannin, and the tannin was ground and used to tan leather. If you look, there are generally 4 or 5 guys. They call them, can't remember what they had a name for them, but they would cut up a ring around the tree about 4 feet up from the stump and at the stump, and then split it, and with a bark spud, take that first ring off, take the bark off, and pile it on the ground, and then they drop the tree and do the rest of the tree. And they did that because they didn't want to damage that bark. It was worth quite a bit. You can see over here on the right, the fellows peeling that bark. They would put that in ricks, they called them, and top-load rafts later that they sent downriver, where it was made into the actual material with which they'd tan the hides. So my notes here, Jamestown had 4 tanneries at one time, which was quite a little bit. They would immerse hides after they would flesh them. They would take the hair and the fat and the meat off them, immerse them in that solution of that tannic acid and water, very hot water, and that would tan them into leather. Now, absent environmental regulations of today, almost all the residue from those tanning baths were dumped into the river. And in 1906, the local paper recorded that all the fish for 5 miles down the river, all the fish were killed by release of that material. So, fortunately, they found a substitute, and that was a South American wood that had far more tannin in it, and began importing that material for tanning the hides. And they also determined it was cheaper to send the tannic products out to Chicago, where they were having stockyards built, and do the tanning out in the Chicago area. But in 1880, the Fredonia Censor had an article that 10 million tons of hemlock bark and 350,000 tons of oak bark had been produced in our region that year for tannin. That's a lot of material. Hemlock stopped being, I'll call it, when we started using hemlock for sidewalks about 1875. Before that, it was just stripped and left to rot in the woods. The other thing that helped us is that the hemlock began to be used because we had basically used up all the pine, and it was the next next closest to pine that was in abundance. And Buffalo, New York was having a building boom about 1893, and so we began exporting hemlock up to the Buffalo area. So to do all this required tools. And Jamestown actually became very, very well known nationally for its axes. Many different varieties, we call them patterns of axes, were made here. The first at Fuller and Crane in 1834, but my wife lived on Jefford Street down here off 2nd, and there was a big axe factory there. So some of the styles, this is more an American axe. That one over there is a European pattern. Broad wing axes, double bit axes, all different kinds of axes and adze. Cooper's adze would be to hollow out the insides of barrels, staves for barrels, and foot axes for flattening out timbers. So about the 17th century, crosscut saws began replacing axes as the preferred tools in the woods. And again, Jamestown was very famous for its production of saws. Fred Moore of Jamestown, I had one of their saws for a while and used it up until probably 10 years ago. Two main types were felling saws and bucking saws. The felling saws were a little narrower, front to back, and that was so that you could put a wedge in behind it if you need to coax the tree in a certain direction. The bucking saw was more for cutting logs into lengths. So the process started, obviously, with cutting down one of these big trees, and then the trees were cut into bolts about 16 feet long, and because various loggers were all taking their timber to the sawmills at the same time, they would brand the end or butt end of the tree or bolt with their own pattern so that people knew whose log they were cutting and could tally it up. So there's some pretty big logs coming to the mills. That over there, the house is directly across from what's now the Bemis Point Post Office, and they were probably going up to Brown Road to saw those out. This one I didn't remember just where that was, but certainly some huge logs. That's over in Sinclairville by Mill Stream. And Phillips Mill was right down by my home off 430 near the Chautauqua Brickyard. It happened to be also where they built 3 of the steamboats that were on the lake. Once they were cutting bolts, if it was wintertime, they could sled them. They would ice down a path to make it easier to move, and then they would put a ramp up to the first log and a chain around and behind it, and from the other pull the log up to the top with another rig of horses. Now you got to cut them. So the very first means of cutting was very laborious. It was called a pit saw or a stanchion saw. There'd be a gentleman on the top who was a more skilled sawyer, and then a man underneath who really provided the power because he pulled down the saw and gave it the power to cut through. The man on top directed the saw's cut. So the poor guy on the bottom worked down in the pit, ended up becoming called a pit man, and then that name was kind of shortened to pitman. And pitman is one of the components on most any engine. By the way, they cut about 200 feet a day of planks. And we started mechanizing sawmills. There were 3 types of mechanized sawmill: an undershot wheel, which would be found on the Chattacoin and other really low gradient, slow flowing streams. The water came into the paddle wheels of the wheel below the halfway point. Breast shot, the water came in about midway, and then the more famous, iconic picture of the overshot wheel shown here, where the water comes in up on top. We didn't have a lot of streams that had a gradient enough to have an overshot. Dutch Hollow was one of them, but they had the most power and could saw the most logs. This is actually backwards. There's some of the earliest of the mills. Most every township had a mill. So they would start cutting, and they'd have a number of different people whose logs were in the mill at one time very often. So they'd check the stamp and record that length and diameter of the saw log so that they could properly pay the individual. The outer cuts, the first cut that you took on the diameter of or the circumference, of the log were called scantlings, and they even used those. It was kind of like the hog where you use everything but the squeal. Sawdust, again, absent environmental rules, the sawdust was dumped into the creek, and later on, as mills became steam powered, it became used as fuel, so it was a little more energy efficient and environmentally efficient. So the first of the mechanized saws drove a vertical 6-foot long saw. See if I've got a picture of it here. Like that. It was called an up and down or sash saw, and you pushed a timber into the saw by hand, and it was very slow going. Said to go up today and down tomorrow. But it was an improvement over the pit saw in that it could cut much more, about 1,000 to 1,200 feet a day of lumber. James Prendergast came up with the idea of using a gang saw, and he had one down here in Brooklyn Square. Same idea, but multiple saw blades so that he could cut multiple pieces of lumber at one time. Now later on, they got a little smarter, and they got rid of the big bulky framework that the saws were on, and instead made up a thicker saw blade and had it run against lignum vitae, which is a very hard wood block. So the saw could move up and down faster and cut more lumber. The downside was that saw blade was fairly thick, so it wasted a lot of wood. 1808, the invention of the band saw. You can see there's 2 opposing circular wheels and an endless saw blade which just continues on and on. became popular here about 1885. A lot less wood loss and a lot faster as far as cutting. Mid-1850s, two of the local steam saw mills that were in the greater Jamestown area, and they ran circular saws. So we did have use locally. These are some of the uses. Homes got bigger as wood became more available. But interestingly, if you look at that landscape behind, there isn't many. It's pretty well been decimated. They also cut shingles, especially during the winter when there was nothing to do. They would cut the logs, the small logs, into bolts and then split them and then put them on the shaving horse and with a draw shave draw them down to the proper thickness. They were about a 3/4 of an inch on the end and about a 1/4 inch on the other end. So a gentleman from Pomfret in 1830 invented a mechanical shingle cutter, and with that, shingles took off as a means of making a living. This is up on Brown Road. Brown Road is right behind the Bemis Point United Methodist Church, and there's remnants of that mill still there today. But the interesting part is to go from making single shingles to 15 million shingles a year. And all of those were sent south that weren't used here on rafts. We also made plank roads. We had 7 plank roads. And this will give you an idea of the amount of lumber it took for the central plank road. There were sleepers that ran the length of the road and then planks on top, all pretty good sized pieces of lumber. But between the two of those, probably 16 million board feet of lumber to build that one plank road. Interestingly, the boards were kept parallel. So often they would let one hang out. And that was so that if you were going along in your buggy and your buggy got off, that would give the buggy wheel something to lift it back up onto the road. Another use here, all the hotels on the lake, but Helen Ebersol did an accounting of what went into the first Kent house. And you can see just over 2 million square feet of lumber in that one hotel. And think of all the hotel houses around the lake. Another use in the steamboats, you start thinking about the Nettie Fox or City of Jamestown, which is there, or the Jamestown, excuse me, held 3,000 passengers. So it takes a lot of lumber for a boat that size. Then you have all the naphtha launches, the small steamers, double-end rowboats, the wharves that the steamboats came in on. All of these things took a massive amount of lumber. But where did the rest go? And that was the nexus of my book. New Orleans at the time was the second most populous city in the United States next to New York City. Cincinnati was next because it was a jumping off place for people going west. And they were all growing like crazy. The important thing about our topography, the outlet from Chautauqua Lake feeds into the Chattacoin River, feeds into the Conowongo, feeds into the Allegheny, feeds into the Ohio, feeds into the Mississippi. And that was a way south, a cheap way south. The next nearest place that could happen is in mid-state New York in the Susquehanna. All the other streams flow north, and there wasn't anybody to buy stuff up there. So it was very hugely important that we had the flow that we did down those rivers. Those had been thoroughly used by first the indigenous population and then by people bringing goods and services up to our settlers in flatboats and keelboats and taking goods that we had manufactured here south on flatboats, keelboats, and then store boats. Traveled. And it's a very circuitous route. And that would come into play when we started trying to ship lumber. There's a little more detail of our river system flowing south down the Allegheny and down to the Ohio. So, rafts, these are some of the first rafts that were sent down. The second one wasn't actually a raft, it was on a flatboat. But, gives you the idea of about the time frame we're talking. The gentleman in the woods would cut, take them to the mill, cut them to 16-foot lengths, and make boards out of them. And they would of the root, and then they build a raft. Two 10 by 16-foot skids, or those were that you wanted to keep your boat from being broken up by stones and that. Heavy timber like that would go over the top of the stones. And then there were tie pieces or cross pieces. So let's take a look. Here's a crib, what we call a crib, and this would have been about 16 feet by 16 feet. The running planks are on the bottom, and the cross pieces or tie boards on top. And then they had a vertical piece that was driven up through a 2-inch hole from the bottom. And what those were hickory or oak or elm, any good hardwood sapling, about 2 inches around, off about 4 feet up the tree, pull it up by the roots, and cut the majority of the roots off, like right in here, leaving a root ball, which would keep that grub from pulling out. That's what it was called, the grub. And you can see them there. They've put the planks that they're going to make up the raft, and then they put tie boards on top, and they take what they call a witch, and they would pry down. It would go around that grub stake. They'd pry down on it, and that would lever all those boards together, and then they'd put wedges around it, all that. So you had a good tight package. That 16-foot by 16-foot raft was called a piece. And they would lay that up depending on the fresh, and I'll define fresh as any rise in the level of the water caused by rain or snowmelt or man's intervention. And you get freshes a year, a spring fresh, which was due to the meltwater, a summer fresh, which could be any severe storm, and then a fall fresh. And then you also could get a pond fresh, where a gentleman with a mill would dig a pond, let it fill up, get his rafts ready, and then break the dam on the pond fresh and float the raft down the river. The Chattacoin, being what it wasn't wide enough to have much of a raft in there, so a 16 by 16 foot piece was quite common coming down the river. That might stop here in town. There were a number of sawmills here in town, and be made into any amount of things here in town, or it might be sent on down the Chattacoin to the Conowanga. They gang these pieces together so they were 2 platforms wide and 3 platforms long. So you got 32 by 48 now. And each one had